Hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on when you're viewing this. My name is Allison Zamuda. And Heidi, if you can share the screen so we can get this session going. So this first session is really about extending into designing learning in manageable chunks. And the interesting dynamic of this, as we start reflecting back on what we did in our first couple weeks in March, of really assembling a set of assignments and then pushing them out there virtually or remotely for families to begin to make sense of and pay attention to. And one of the interesting things, as we've learned, not only through our own consulting work, but also through interviewing folks all over the globe, is how to continue to think through a different, more sophisticated, but also more compelling and engaging way to share the learning experiences, to preview the learning experiences, not just to promote engagement of students and families, but also to make it so that it is accessible so students and families can plan their weeks ahead of schedule. So I am going to turn it over to Heidi in a moment, but I want to continue to say how honored and thrilled I am to partner with Heidi as we continue to think about this work, both pre-pandemic, thinking about phenomenon-based learning and growing more future-forward compelling experiences into the conversations that we're having right now. Heidi?
Thank you, Allison. And as you know, I feel similarly happy about our collaboration. You're a remarkable thinker, and your expertise at personalized learning comes from a conviction that we should really engage our students and see ourselves as partners with them in their own growth and learning. So moving forward, the goal of this session is pretty straightforward. It's going to be looking at deliberate and intentional instructional actions to design future-forward, responsive, and engaging learning experiences. And to recap, Alice and I started to use some terminology to help us wrap our heads around the experience that we're all going through. And I think I can honestly say that I've never experienced anything like this in my lifetime. And my hunch is that you share that. So in triage, which has been what we're just coming out of now, triage is a battlefield term. And it's used when there is a sudden catastrophe or a sudden act of surprising impact. It could be natural, it could be wartime, and people have to react quickly. They use the best they have. They throw what they can at a problem and they sort the best they can. And it's not perfect. And I would say arguably that's what's been happening around our country and to a great extent overseas as well. Out of triage, however, there are lessons learned that can inform us as we work on making a transition, which is what we are all about today. And moving forward as we anticipate the return of school. There's uncertainties. There'll be uncertainties just on the basic question of whether there'll be an online model, an on-site model, or a hybrid, and uncertainties about what your students have experienced. What we know is we need to be agile, we need to be prepared, and again, we need to learn the lessons from the triage period. Then we also know there'll be a post-pandemic view of schools, and we're not going to go back to school. We will be going forward because every teacher who has gone through this period has learned things about themselves and how to connect with kids. There's been surprises. There's also been some points that have been validated about how we all need one another in a learning environment and how we can thrive. We hope to inform our thinking with those practices. Allison?
So when it comes to the power of pedagogy and how that continues to drive and shape our instruction, whether it is in the pre-pandemic phase or what you experienced in the triage moment, to try to step back and take a look at the idea of antiquated, classical, and contemporary. This actually was first promoted and suggested in the book Bold Moves by Heidi and our mutual colleague and dear friend, Marie Alcock. And the point and the purpose of this is to really start having teachers cycle back and take a look at what's antiquated. Antiquated means what is it that you're interested in cutting back on, cutting out. And the intention is similar to what library media specialists have been doing for years and years. The notion of weeding the stacks. On some level, it was important and timely in a particular moment of time. But often that time potentially fades as new things crop up and demand more attention. New theories are developed. Even from a historical point of view, chronology keeps going, and trying to think through and figure out how might I continue to sort through themes, through problems, through issues in a way that is a bit different, that very much impacts the storyline. So that's the regular practice of a what to cut, not because we're weeding out the antiquated once and for all, but that regular cycle of practice is significant and important. The second part is the classical, what to keep. The intention is that there are some incredibly strong practices that we know are timeless in nature. So the intention of trying to grow that capacity as well as hold on to something that we know is fundamentally working, because we start to see not just the power in previous years, but the power of right now. So thinking about growing students' capacity to question, to inquire, you're modeling that on their behalf, but it's still a substantive seminal skill that we want to continue to support and move from. And finally, contemporary, what to create. The opportunity to be tuned into emergent topics and phenomenons and ideas. And on some level, the opportunity to see, even during this time, acts of creation continues to offer fresh thinking and insight, but also continues to clarify that the curriculum challenge that you're facing right now is a challenge of something that is embracing the world as it is, as opposed to deciding that you can't cover that right now because it's not part of what you were imagining the year before. So the interesting dynamic of contemporary is all of that continues to be refreshed and reimagined, not just in extraordinary circumstances like what we're facing now, but periodically as part of regular practice. So as we move to the next slide, we're really starting to think through our role right now of how we're making these kind of instructional choices, not just on behalf of students, but often with students and their families. So we're really trying to tease out and think through, as the summer months are going on, but also in the opening of school, how can we listen well? How can we begin to understand where students and families are? How can we look with a critical eye at local and global conversations and begin to think through what other challenges are people facing in addition to COVID-19? So this is an important moment where you can step back and talk about and think through the economy, for example, the Black Lives Matter, the important and significant ideas that continue to roll out over the scope of the summer, very much on families' minds. And there is a space not just for engaging in civil discourse, but to use that and leverage that in the co-creation of the designs. So as we create, imagine, and innovate, we're also quietly suggesting that while you may have some good ideas to begin to frame that, you also don't want to take up all of the airspace in the creating and imagining. Beginning to have conversations with students and families so that they continue to influence the problems, the projects, the themes, the issues over the scope of the year. And finally, thinking interdependently. again, as you're starting to make sense of all of this, it's very much an integrated approach, not just with families and students, as we were just suggesting, but also really starting to tune into what other colleagues are doing. Thinking about looking at this through vertical teams, through an interdisciplinary approach. All of that continues to inform the manageable chunks of learning that this session is going to be focused on. Heidi?
Allison, great. I appreciate your point. What we're looking at today, if you'll recall, is in our last session that we did, and we hope you'll look at that as well, but we'll bring forward if this is your first one, is that decision-making needs to occur where we're making curriculum decisions informed by future forward learning goals. In your case, it will be your transformative goals that will inform the decisions about curriculum and instruction, about what you're going to view as what is most important. You'll be looking at the question of what to cut out, cut back on, consolidate, create, because we can't just go forward assuming that COVID didn't happen. It has. And one way or another, even if it hadn't, these are important questions for us to consider, whether it's within our subjects, whether it's interdisciplinary in nature in the work we do on a daily basis, or it's phenomena-based. Today, in particular, we're looking at that bottom row there. That isn't really bottom in terms of what it is for students, but it's actually the place where we make decisions that make a difference as we inform our lesson plans and we move forward. In the chat, we'd like you to post, if you would, some lessons learned about writing activities and lesson plans through this triage period of the current crisis. We know you've been through a lot. We want to begin to look at that row of making those decisions, again, in subjects, interdisciplinary, or phenomena-based. And what we're looking for are your lessons learned. What have you experienced? So if you would pause, we'll be back in about 5 minutes. Thank you. Welcome back. Our hunch is that one of the things that you observed in your lessons learned is that there was a lot that proved overwhelming, that we packed in so many learning experiences and triage. We wanted to keep the kids busy. That may not have been the case for you, but it is certainly something that we've been seeing across the country. This is literally an excerpt from a second grade schedule. And if you'll look to the right, you'll see the writing experiences for the week. I'd like you to know that for second grade, they had 8 different subjects. And when I counted, they had well over 65 activities and tasks for a week. And this particular district, which is a marvelous place, is taking a hard look at the fact that it was just too much. Teachers sort of began to feel they were in paralysis. Students stopped participating. We know that in some of our urban areas, close to half the students threw in the towel after a few weeks. We have to look at this. And I think the other lesson is that perhaps we do this anyway too much. So specifically, one of the outcomes we have found in our interviews with people like David Loveland at Hong Kong International School, where they had a kind of a dress rehearsal for COVID because last fall, they had protests and the schools were suddenly closed in Hong Kong and they were caught unawares. They had to move to a full online experience and have outstanding resources and teachers. Nevertheless, they realized they needed to dive in, come up with a crisis management team and be able to respond better. And they did. And what happened is it wasn't another set of protests at that time, but in January it was COVID. And the number one finding they had was that the audience for writing plans, the audience was both students and parents, and that we needed to use language that wasn't jargony, educationese. Parents don't go around the house talking about proficiency targets. They don't talk about priority standards. They don't talk about formative assessments. Neither do students. And that if our audience has shifted, then we have to shift our language, not in a way that is demeaning, but respectful, simplified, frankly, more elegant in the way we communicate. Simple and clear is good. We also realized we could overwhelm ourselves as well as with our learners' experience by moving to coverage, keeping them busy. Another finding, which is in part one of the reasons we're titling our session about manageable chunks, is people want to be able to have a size of experience that they can handle, that's accessible. So many districts moved to a week at a glance. Another big outcome was the use of icons. They're tremendously helpful. We know they improve engagement. We know they help clarify what an action is, but they also indicate variety. So when we look at examples, we want to make sure that the information is streamlined, that we're able to respond in a way that's clear. I particularly like this example because of the learning targets at the top. Allison, would you comment on this one?
Absolutely. And if you can go back to the previous slide for a second, Heidi. So Heidi mentioned that we had an opportunity together to interview David Loveland from Hong Kong International School at the high school level. We also had an opportunity to interview the early school principal as well. His name is Jeff, and the blog post that we drafted is also on the landing page, which we'll show you at the end of the session. And so that you'll start to see the parallels of approaches that they engaged in. So again, paying attention to audience as both students and parents. And that's what we're going to see in a moment in the next slide. But I also think the significance of how do we continue to focus on, from a teacher point of view, on what is most significant and important. And I think as we're moving into this next slide, I'm remembering Jeff, the principal of the primary school, said he had this mantra of focusing on teaching, not assigning. So oftentimes, some of the assignments, the experiences that are listed here on slide 11, again, it's an example that comes from the Hong Kong International School. He really counseled his classroom teachers to pay attention to the conversation, the sharing, as opposed to feeling like everything must be graded. So as you can start seeing the due dates on the bottom of the screen, begin to start thinking about in what ways did you get stuck a bit and thinking about what you needed to put feedback or comments on, and where was it overwhelming? Where was the assignment train actually becoming too much for you to do in addition to developing the next week's assignments? The other thing that this visual continues to reveal, not just the clarity, and again, this is a day at a glance. So I also want to clarify that this principal gave families a week at a glance so that they could plan their day. But from a student's point of view, the teacher gave them one day at a time. So this is what typical practice looks like. They do a morning meeting in primary all the way up through second grade. And the morning meeting was a recorded statement, about 4 minutes or less. And basically, the teacher wished the students a good morning and then explained the ideas and the expectations for the day. And that was actually a reaction from what parents wanted, because families didn't want to lead that process. They really wanted the teachers to do it so that the families could actually work collaboratively together, as opposed to a parent being the boss of a student. Heidi?
Yes, one of the other key findings we have found is we're all, I'm sure, familiar with the power of essential questions in unit design. One thing that you'll find is, especially in online planning, you will be managing weeks. Families understand that concept. But it was critical. There was an essential question that would be the thread through those experiences. In the example I showed you before from Texas, what was very interesting to me, and I've seen in a lot of places, is there would be sets of learning experiences, but there was no connective tissue there. Whereas in the schools where we employed essential questions as the through line, that made a big difference with supportive guiding questions as well. Right now, I want to show you an example of something that really was inspirational for me and for Allison as well. Back in March, I was approached by New Haven Public Schools, where I've done a great deal of work. And one of their directors, who is a head of magnet schools there, said, we need to find a way to reach our parents. And so many of our teachers have done online work, but others are finding it challenging. Can we come up with a better format? We also want to keep them hooked. We want to keep them engaged. So one of the key notions was that we would rethink the titles, we would come up with the hooks, and we would use essential questions. So I'm going to take you right now to a simple doc where you can see the way we started to plan. And as you'll notice, one of the key things were visuals. And so in the district, which has a very sizable number of kids on free and reduced lunch, many families who are, their kids are ESL students, the key was that it was written for them, and we had a more compelling type of theme or title. It could have been a problem, could have been an issue, could have been a case study, it could have been a topic. But we tried to make it interesting. The language in the synopsis, the thumbnail, kind of echoing what you were just speaking about, Allison, was parent friendly. We had an overarching essential question. They also only took a handful of standards to bundle them, as opposed to a laundry list that could be somewhat distracting. When you look at the week at a glance, it looks interesting. And they had a title for each of their days. And so instead of it being 100 activities that are spread out between reading, math, science, and the like, wherever possible, they tried to make them more interdisciplinary. And even within a subject, what you will see is that they use the same notion. So there was the focus for the day. They called them compelling questions, but these were the essential questions. And you would also see, what you'll also see is that we were able to provide continuity in the layout. So in looking at this notion, the idea was that it was easier for the kids and the families to relate to. But I think this is one of the great points, and that is we simplified the language and we started to use icons. It's a winner. Icons work. And what it is if you went back in, and I'm going to go back in a moment and show you, we changed the language. So it wasn't just a list of task, or even activities. We actually wanted to use more lively and vibrant language. So in interviewing both parents and teachers and students, I said, what is it you really want to have happen? Well, we really want kids to be engaged to start. So the first section of a lesson or a lesson set will have engage as opposed to task. Then we want them to demonstrate, to show what they're learning. This is where you would have embedded your formative assessments. Then we wanted to share. We use this language across the board with icons to indicate the type of action, the actual thing the student will be doing or creating. So I'm going to go back. I want to show you if I can here. Let's get this up. Let's scroll down again. Now, if you'll look down here below where we had the week at a glance, what you'll see is you'll see icons. What you'll see is as we plan the week's activities, you'll look at a range of these with hyperlinks that show the variety of what students are doing. It also would be interesting because if all we saw was read, write, read, quiz, we had immediate understanding that this particular teacher was kind of stuck on one type of way of performing. So the power of icons is they provide excellent communication tools and they indicate a variety of experiences. What is more, students start to generate those icons as well. This is an example now of a lesson plan set from Humble, Texas. Teachers will embed the icons, as can students, and this is the language they're using. Discover, explore, practice, and create and share. One thing that's interesting is you'll see where it says your task. That means this is probably going to be a more teacher-directed or co-created task. But we can give it to learners. Well, the word will change to my task, or if it's in a group, our task, with the additional resources. You'll see the essential questions, you'll see the learning outcome, and you'll see the launch or the hook. In Humble, Humble, which is again a suburb of Houston, they have tied all of the learning sets, they're calling them, instead of week at a glance, which is fine. But the notion here is they are tied directly back to their unit design, which is kind of the blueprints that come from their frameworks that they've been building for years in the courses, and up to their North Star, which in this case is their portrait of a graduate. Here's the important thing here. If teachers are only writing lesson plans without those connections, then in a sense, there's a tendency towards some slippage. There is a tendency towards cherry picking. These are the things I'm doing to keep kids busy, as opposed to really finding a connection to what we think is important for our kids to have, so that we're guided by our North Star. Allison?
So we heard one focus example on Week at a Glance. The example that you just came from with Heidi was what they call a learning set, again, designed through the lens of a Week at a Glance. And this third example is designed in Canvas as a learning management system, and they call them learning modules. But at the same time, they have a clarity that, one more time, it is Week at a Glance. And they have, again, a very clean connection to the example that Heidi just walked us through. The notion of launch, explore, and share. And again, this is a high school district. So it's interesting to start to see the power of visuals, but also the power of fresh and invitational language. So when you're starting to take a look at launch, really starting to pay attention to who is actually doing the launch. Oftentimes, the teacher is actually taking the lead here to frame the conversation, to generate interest and excitement, because there are some topics or areas of interest the student may not have actual experience in or connection to. So the part of how we're inviting students into our conversation, whether it's through 1 week at a time or thinking about the broader unit, the launch is really where the essential questions live as we're starting to move into that conversation. The launch is where you're doing something like a KWL, but more intentionally designed to actually involve kids in the experience. If I do an essential question and a KWL, whether it's a simplified version or a more amplified version, when I do that, it starts to shift the territory that I move into. So the interesting dynamic as we're thinking about explore is that it may be something that I've already designed parameters around. So I'm giving them an opportunity to move into a particular task or text or series of problems that I've developed. But at the same time in Explore, I need to make room or space for a co-created level of experience in the way the students want to approach or move through a particular text or a series of problems, or the opportunity for them to go find and excavate other interesting tools or resources to continue to deepen the exploration, not just for their own learning, but to share that with the class. And finally, the sharing piece of the way we're trying to continue to have students be engaged in their level of demonstration of proficiency or sharing their learning with others. So it's not just having kids have an opportunity to think about the format for which they share, but there also has to be some accepted scoring criteria to demonstrate what proficiency looks like in this particular district. And you can do that through existing rubrics, or you can begin to move into the territory of a more co-created set of rubric experiences. Next slide. So the other interesting piece, and again, if you wanted to revisit the previous session, we talked about that graphic organizer with the 6 columns. And if you want to take a quick snippet of what that graphic organizer looks like, you can do so on the landing page after the presentation is over. But the intention here is that we're trying to make a very clear bridge in this particular school district between what Climb 3 was in examining their existing curriculum and making thoughtful choices to where they're heading now with Launch, Explore, and Share. So the interesting part of this, as we started to take a look, if you can move to the next slide, Heidi. As we started to take a look at what was already preloaded in Canvas in terms of icons, when we studied this list together, both within the school district, and Heidi and I actually had an opportunity to study this list as well, it was pretty close to what Heidi was saying earlier. So it's read, and then you have a quiz. You have a question, you're going offline, here's your checklist, here's your to-do list. It really, on some level, is continuing to promote this level of hierarchy. I'm the teacher, I'm telling you what to do, you're the student, your job is to do it. So if you can see on the upper right-hand corner, read this. And that kind of interesting dynamic of, okay, so how do we actually begin to pause and take another look at that? So that's the before picture. And within several days' time, you'll see the after picture. Next slide. So this after picture, again, is a work in progress. But start to think through the distinctions they made from the previous slide to what you see on this slide. So notice with the 4th column, the learning target, learning goal, and big idea, continuing to make clarity that the learning target are those direct knowledge and skills that inform the learning in this particular week. But the learning goal is really tending to those overarching transfer goals, or in the world of Lower Merion, those transformative goals. And the big idea is really the heartbeat of the essential question. But you're starting to see a much more playful view of icons. So the notion of checkpoints, as you can see on that first row, 2nd column, because you're trying to identify moments of checkpoints or check-ins rather than being this as a scoring tool. So the notion or the approachability or the invitational aspect of this also continues to connect to what Heidi was describing as the power of icons in the first place. And you can see on the right side why icons. This is their explanation to all of their faculty members on staff to explain the reason why they should be using the icons as they're developing learning modules in their learner management system. Heidi?
Let's go to our chat right now, and we're going to take about 5 minutes. We'd like to invite you to respond to these 2 questions. The value of clear and direct language with parents and learners, see if this lines up with your own experience and thinking. And do you see the value in using icons as we look at more manageable sets? So we'll be back in 5 minutes. Thanks. Welcome back. One of the other points as we reflected back a few moments ago on icons and communication is that there will be more and more movement towards mobile apps, which are already in existence. And as you will see, they tend to have an attractive format if they're well designed that will be using not only these elements that we're discussing in curriculum, but will also be invitational in the way they engage our students in their work. So this language is contemporary. It's a better way of working. And I think what we'll find is that it's going to work particularly well for a wide array of family populations and parents and caregivers. So there's a certain universality to it that leans towards engagement. Another thing that we know is particularly important, we found this on the New Haven project, but we've also found it in projects we're working on with a wide variety of schools around the country and overseas, is to make the title engaging. And in our other session, the complement to this one, we spent some time going into some detail on the 5 genres. Let me just touch on it here if I might. What we're really saying is you have, as a designer, a series of generic choices that you can use to shape or create a composition. If, Allison, you were writing a book, you could choose to write a book that, let's say it was personal, that was a series of vignettes. It could be a memoir. It could be an autobiography. You could also write poetry if you chose, but the fact is you have a lot of different formats you could choose from. And you try to choose the format that best matches your message. Similarly, as a teacher, whatever you're teaching, you can make it more compelling by choosing the lens in which your students will share the view with you. You can choose it by topic. There's nothing wrong with the topic. It's usually, however, best suited to foundational background. You would find a topic, say, for example, in an encyclopedia. That's how they're organized, sort of subject matter catchments, if you will. Themes are more conceptual. You see themes across the board. Many of you use themes, but notice they are often interdisciplinary. Themes might be something like rites of passage or conflict or patterns. Problem-based studies focus on a specific problem situation that's begging for a solution. And the information you study is in service of that inquiry. Issue-based units are about examining perspectives on a point of controversy that really can't be resolved, and people hold very, sometimes fierce views on it. And we want our learners to understand the reasons why, so that they not only can take their own position, but recognize the consequences of viewpoints. Case studies are an opportunity to take a deeper dive into instances, situations, scenarios, or even comparative books. So in looking at how we present the material, it's not only that it's a manageable chunk, it's not only that there's an interesting essential question, or we use icons, it's what it's about.
Yeah.
And so in looking at that question, let's say you had the opportunity to deal with a topic like solar energy. There's nothing wrong with that. In particular, if it's the first go round. But there's also the possibility of expanding that notion to sustainability, not only of our ecosystem, but even the sustainability of family life or traditions or the way we communicate. We could look at a problem, how to design a solar collector to run your school. In it, you will be looking at background information, but the primary focus, the lens, would be in generating that solution. Or an issue like this one from Juneau, Alaska, the rainforest, log it or leave it. When I was working there, it was fascinating to me because there is a rainforest there, and the 6th grade team was examining the issue. They knew they weren't going to resolve it, but they wanted students to appreciate and understand why people felt so strongly about it. Or a case study like Biosphere 2. Now, a critical point here, just like an English teacher can teach their students about different choices in terms of writing, we can teach students about these different areas or lenses, which they can use to create their own personal journeys, their own projects
Heidi,
that are driven.
Before you
Please
move,
do.
I want to clarify for folks that are teaching at a secondary level, particularly my high school colleagues. As a former high school teacher, oftentimes when we're looking at things on a few earlier slides for K2, where you had those small but captivating pictures or illustrations that paired with the manageable chunks, you might say, well, our students are beyond that they can just use the essential questions, or they can pay attention to the language or the words. But as we're starting to see, and we're not only in our children, I have a sophomore in high school and a first year in college, but you're also starting to see the visual nature of learning. And so the intention here is that that visual construct actually sets the stage in a way to make the language worth accessing, worth reading. So the power of the visual and the writing together is as important for a first grader as it will be for a 16-year-old or 17-year-old.
Allison, let me also clarify something. It's a great point. In the upgraded, if you will, improved icon batch that you showed, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that was from a high school district.
Yes.
That's right. And so the point here is, and this example actually comes from a set of middle schools and high schools that did some comparative case studies. This is good design.
Yes.
And so good design, of course, the language I might use to describe a specific type of task is going to be calibrated and matched to my high school learners. But nevertheless, I don't think we can assume that just a list of tasks will engage them. More to the point, again, I want to reiterate something. When we see a certain trend towards certain icons all the time, one of my personal favorites that I had to laugh at was the read this. That's a real invitation. But if I see read this again and again and again and again with quiz, you've got to take a second look at the range of learning experiences that you're designing. And I think all of you know very much what we're talking about here. So moving on, Allison?
So this is a helpful example as we're trying to imagine and organize ourselves around a blended learning experience for much, if not all, of next school year. And starting to pay attention to what do we know about blended learning pedagogy. So I think it's incredibly helpful to engage in a rich exploration and conversation about what you're finding from places that have been doing virtual learning for several years. So whether you're looking at a great resource from Harvard, or you're looking at the Global Online Academy, there are rich and important places for you to go and visit and engage in conversation around those findings or recommendations. But this is a set from the same school district that I'm working with in California of what they started to clarify and identify as most significant and important. But at the same time, as you're reading it, you're looking at it through the lens of a blended learning experience, meaning that this is what they believe to be powerful contemporary practice, whether it's through a brick and mortar environment or whether it's through an online delivery system, whether it's synchronous or asynchronous. So the intention, for example, is that every assignment needs to have explicit instructions, because oftentimes you may not be available to help that student. They can't wave their hand and have you come to them immediately. In fact, you might be working with another group of students, and the student that needs assistance is doing this work asynchronously. So that is a concrete example that is not only something that is helpful and important in this learning situation that we're facing right now, but it will be important after the situation is over. So as we're starting to think about these ideas, not just what teachers are expecting to do in their approach to designing learning experiences, this also is a helpful illustration of what personalizing learning is really embedded and cares most deeply about. So we're trying to think about who's designing the learning experiences in a way of getting students to be more invested in the design. For example, we talked about the visuals that are connected to each learning module or learning set. It would be fabulous for students after the experience is over to propose a visual instead of the one that you initially created, to make the case for why one visual or a multiple set of visuals more inform the conversation and the exploration based on their own design. The other aspect of this is really growing students' capacity to become increasingly self-directing, self-navigating. We want to make sure that students are capable of managing, not only because of the design principles on the previous slide, so that they have explicit instructions, but when they get stuck, they are trained to continue to move through a particular set of steps to help them get unstuck, so that they're not continuing to be so dependent on the classroom teacher.
So another review of a few points that have come up in interactions with school groups we've worked with, and they are around the country, Oregon, California, Texas, Ohio, Chicago, states all through the Northeast, including other districts within Pennsylvania as well, Florida. We both could go through a long list of places. And we want you to know that. We feel like part of our job is to be a good conduit, to be conduits and share best practices. But I also want to suggest that we've also been learning from partners overseas. Recently, Benna Kalik and I interviewed 9 educators from Denmark, and the students have been back now for almost 5 weeks, and what their experience has been. Allison mentioned 2 calls and 2 contacts, Zoom calls with the group in Hong Kong. And one of the things we realize is that in engaging students in the planning process, what we want to do is determine when a check-in is essential. And that is going to be a developmental consideration. What we do know is students need that. There may be points where in asynchronous learning, students will be able to work more effectively on their own, but they need to have a place where they know they will be getting feedback and checking in with their teacher. In many ways, the morning meeting that you mentioned, Allison, is a great point. Places we can count on. I think that's true whether you're on site or you're online. We also want to begin to look at the submission of more formative types of assessments, assessment for learning, and to co-create those plans. Otherwise, all it is about compliance as opposed to engagement. There's also the necessity to determine when there are essential synchronous sessions. And one thing I've been finding in work, in particular, I've been finding this with middle and high schools, is that when we, at the bottom, you'll see this, but when there's a 5 to 10 minute video where the teacher does a clip about the information that a student can replay, when they do have a synchronous session, it can be more discursive. It can be a discussion. It can be conversational and more interactive as opposed to a lecture. Another concept that we heard right away when we first interviewed David in Hong Kong was the necessity for office hours and guidance. I think that's pretty universally understood, though I think there's also the idea of when you do have your breakout rooms, for example, to be able to go in and take a look, a kind of walkthrough, either as a leader or as a teacher, to observe your students in their interaction. I think the key is we want to be able to ensure that our students develop their capacity to monitor their ability to work well. In this one, I think one of the most interesting is that Michael Mohammed created a terrific blog post that you posted, Allison, yep, on making strategic choices in an online environment that I have hyperlinked here. And I have shared this with a number of classroom teachers who have found it so striking, because he found a way to both use his apps and his tools, to use his video clips, to engage his students using tools on a high level of sophistication, so that when they did have time that was synchronized, it had more value. And when it was asynchronous, they felt connected to him. Could you elaborate, please?
Yeah, so Michael Mohammed has been somebody that I've been connected to for several years. and he continues to demonstrate his instructional chops in making good strategic choices, also working through a lens of personalizing learning and habits of mind. So you can see that was posted on the Habits of Mind site, but there are more posts from Michael on Learning Personalized as well. But at the same time is using tools that he's also grown proficiency in. So Pear Deck and Flipgrid are two concrete examples, but continuing to make sure that the way he is engaging his students is one to be as responsive as possible. I think that's where he's leaning in. So trying to figure out what can I do by myself so that when I have students in front of me, whether it's virtual or showing up in class later on, how can we continue to grow the thinking together? In what ways can I record in advance so I can coach? But also, in what ways can they record so that I can see their learning? And so I think that's the opportunity for synergy. It's not just watch this. You know what I mean?
There you go.
Concrete example. It's watch this because this is my learning experience based on what you've done. So that's the integration of this, in that oftentimes those icons could be used not just in the launch or explore section that teachers are directing students, but also in the share creation session where students are continuing to demonstrate their thinking, their work. Heidi?
Yeah, Allison, before we leave this, I'm just reminded of something that we found in when I go over the blog post on David's blog post. We called it "We Didn't Sign Up for This," which was one of his quotes, 9 lessons learned from a Hong Kong principal. One of the things they did is, because some teachers were not so comfortable with making these short video clips, is they pulled together a team of teachers who were, one was a tech teacher, but a couple of them were just really good at it. And they ran short video development sessions, but they also helped the teachers make a bank of these they could draw from. I thought it was a really smart way to go, so that if I'm not particularly comfortable with it, maybe it's Screencastify. There's a bunch of great tools for those of you who are, but it's a way for colleagues to pull together and make that happen. So in moving forward, we're going to ask you to take 5 minutes. We'd like you to share how you were able to work with your students in the design of virtual learning that was successful, that you found effective. And please share that with your colleagues. We'll take about 5 minutes. Thank you. Another piece that we think is important for you to consider, another perspective in designing these experiences, is that we make the demonstrations of learning timely. If we're trying to engage our learner, we want them to be working with the same types of product and performance developments that are common with modern scientists and modern journalists and modern historians and artists. So this list is a compilation from many different groups that I put together in a book I published in 2017 on active literacy with Routledge. And in that book, I had culled together examples that teachers had used, kind of strategic replacements, upgrades, so that instead of a poster, it might be an infographic. It might be using Storyboard. It might be saying something like, let's do a podcast instead of a speech to the class. It could be sketchnoting or annotation tools such as Paper. Some of you may know that app. It's just terrific. The idea is to not do everything, but to do a few choices and do them well. And so we would encourage you to also engage your learner and have them present possibilities and ways they can demonstrate their learning effectively. So we're going to ask you, if you would, to please kindly share in our chat 1 or 2 takeaways from our session that you hopefully will be of assistance to you as you move forward in creating more manageable, accessible and connected ways of planning.
So if you could do that for a moment, and we'll come back to you just to show you where to find more information. So there are 2 territories we encourage you to join and connect with us in the conversation. The first is visiting the Transform site. So this was a labor of love that Heidi and I actually developed, I think within the first week of the schools shuttering their doors in the middle of March. So the outgrowth of this is really a curated collection of powerful articles, design ideas, issues, case studies that's organized around the triage, transform, post-pandemic that you saw earlier in the session. But also the other aspect of this is that it's inviting people to the conversation through a forum. So that's one way of continuing the conversation. Heidi?
Yes, and let's finish off by showing you where you can get more ideas and resources. And that will be at learningpersonalize.com/Lower Merion. I'm going to go there now. And in this site, what we've put together are resources for all the sessions that Ben Akalik and Allison and I, the 3 of us, are working on. And what we want to show you is that there will be links to materials that we've been referencing. So as you go through, you'll see that if we scroll down and we come to our session today, you'll see some links and some reference tools and graphics, as well as links to many of the sites that we have referenced. So we are going to end our session right now, and we want to thank you so much for your marvelous participation. We look forward to reviewing your chats, and it's been a pleasure to work with you. Allison?
Thank you again so much, and hopefully this is something that can continue to be acted on throughout your conversations and your designs for the upcoming school year. Best of luck.
Take care and be safe. Bye-bye.